carbon taxes, deadly topic in many parts of the world, but most especially, I think, in Alberta. Kevin Godet joins us now because they're looking at carbon tax.
Well, they've got one.
Yeah,
and
it's $1 trillion per year right now.
Well, they've got a couple of different ones depending on it. So this is the challenge with carbon taxes. Which
Right.
ones are we talking about? So there's the usual gas taxes in place that people pay at the pump that are hidden. There are wellhead taxes. But there's a specific carbon tax at $15 a ton that's imposed on large emitters in Alberta, and that carbon tax was sunsetted and is due to expire by the end of the year. So early in the year, formerly Premier Redford was raising the prospect of what she would replace it with, or how large a tax she would replace it with, and she had proposed the possibility of raising it from $15 a ton to $40 a ton, and now Jim Prentice is saying that he's not sure what yet he's going to do.
Yeah, he's between a rock and a hard spot because oil prices have declined like a stone. So, it's good for the consumer that happens. But on the flip side of things, if he puts a carbon tax, that's going to flow through the consumer.
Well, at the end of the day, businesses are just basically consumers in a different, rolled up at a higher level.
Absolutely, yeah.
So business taxes in any shape or form all work their way back to a consumer no matter how they manifest themselves. So on one hand, you see Saskatchewan fighting for its pipelines by passing resolutions demanding that governments in eastern Canada let their pipelines go. Jim Prentice is trying to take this statesman-like role. He went to British Columbia, talked about the need for a carbon tax and to work collaboratively, but it raises, of course, a lot of flags in Alberta about how it's going to be manifest. Will they importantly and massively increase gas taxes and or change wellhead fees, which had a big problem for Ed Stelmach before Alison Redford, and or will they, and to what extent will they increase the price on carbon, whether or not it goes from 15 up to somewhere higher. The Pembina Institute wants it to go over $100 a ton. And then the question is, to what emitters will it apply as well? So there are a number of moving parts on what a carbon tax could look like in Alberta.
Yeah, the key to all this, in my mind, is transparency. What are you going to charge where? If you say it's going to be in gasoline, is it going to be buried in gasoline and the consumer never knows what's going on or why? Because if you keep it transparent, the awareness will always be there. And if it's $15 as it stands currently and goes to $40, I'm not saying it's justified, and it would definitely hurt business, but by the same token, people might buy into it a little bit more because they have a revenue shortfall. It's a problem. But they can't justify it on the basis of carbon dioxide issues and global warming and all the other things either. So it's a push me, pull me.
You're right. They're between a rock and a hard place. And Prentice, we could actually almost forgive him because I would argue that it's not a revenue shortfall they have. That's only if you assume that their current spending levels are the ones they ought to maintain.
Good point. Fair point.
I don't mean to suggest that it's easy to just roll back spending because so much of spending is operating costs, which are union negotiated contracts, which are already, they're done. You can't just unilaterally roll them back. It takes time to roll back those types of spending levels, although I argue they ought to. But in the meantime, you're right, there'll be a gap. So the question is, how do they deal with that? I would argue that they probably need to get the union contracts out and renegotiate. But your point, quite simply, is how do they deal with this? And it's in the context of that I looked up the Suzuki Foundation's poll, because I think it's relevant to how do you convince people of the need to close what the governments will call the revenue gap. And so the Suzuki Foundation commissions from Environics a poll with respect to what, in this case, the federal government ought to do with respect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the Suzuki Foundation would argue that this shows a large swath of the Canadian population. They argue 88% when you combine the strongly support and somewhat support. They would argue that indicates that a large population in Canada support efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Well, I would argue there's two problems with this, but they use this to help politicians put in place. So the first thing is, when they say reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's usually code for some type of new large tax. And the second problem with that poll information is...
I have a problem with greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, I didn't want to get into, if you want to get into the whole debate on the whole, greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, climate change / global warming, and we get into that whole science question.
That is the whole question,
well, it's relevant, isn't it?
Yes, it's very relevant.
We don't want to give up the ghost on the important fundamental premise of, is CO2 a problem, and if it is a problem to what? Yeah,
I totally agree. I mean, when you look at global warming and CO2, they are concurrent for entirely different reasons, and one leads the other by 900 years. I mean, who knows what was going on 900 years ago to cause any kind of CO2 levels to be changing? I don't buy that argument, but the general public, 88% in that particular poll, do buy that argument.
Well, part of the problem with the poll is that they were only given basically 3 choices instead of 4 or 5 choices, which is a much more common way to get a wider distribution of responses. When you give people such few choices and greenhouse gas sounds warm and fuzzy, it drives a skew. So I'm not a big fan of that poll, but I wanted to bring it up as an example of the type of what I argue is brainwashing types of activities, which already presupposes, as you point out, that fundamental first premise, which is why we have the climate change summit going on now in Lima. As this happens, I don't know if it's every year, every couple of years, you have 190 countries send a whole whack of folks down, and they sip lattes and drink white wine and talk about how they can tax the planet. And this type of poll feeds into people wanting to increase carbon taxes.
Yeah, climate change is real. I mean, it does happen over time. Whether CO2 is associated with that is unknown. But what you have to deal with is the effects of climate change, because it is going on an ongoing basis. If water levels are going up, then you got to build the walls a little bit higher, that kind of jazz. And people confuse the two issues. It's unbelievable. Oh well.
But the problem is not unbelievable. That it's
Especially
brainwashing.
when it happens like that. It is brainwashing.
Thank
Kevin,
you.
thanks so much. Kevin, good night.